In 1927, a native family of 5 vanished overnight from their small home in northern Arizona. Neighbors found food still on the table, horses still in the corral, but the house was empty, silent, abandoned as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. For 70 years, their disappearance was dismissed as myth, a forgotten story buried in dust. But in 1997, their grandson uncovered a secret hidden beneath the walls of an abandoned mission school. A discovery so shocking, it forced the world to face a truth long denied. The year was 1927, a year when the dust of the Great Depression had begun to drift even into the most remote corners of America. On a small stretch of land in northern Arizona, near the edge of the Painted Desert, the Yazzie family lived quietly in their modest adobe home. Their days were marked not by clocks or schedules, but by the rhythm of the land. The rising of the sun, the cycles of planting and hunting, the songs of the wind across the canyons. The father, Thomas Yazzie, was a tall man in his 40s, his face lined by years of labor beneath the desert sun. He was known for his strength and his fierce sense of justice. Those who lived nearby said Thomas had inherited the stubborn resilience of his people. When others bent under the pressure of government agents or mission schools, Thomas held fast to his traditions, teaching his children their language, their ceremonies, their stories. His wife, Elena Yazzie, carried herself with a quiet grace. She was younger than Thomas, in her early 30s, with long dark hair she often braided before beginning her daily work. Elena was known in the community as a storyteller, her voice weaving old legends into the firelight. She tended not only to her family but to neighbors as well, providing herbs, prayers, and comfort when illness struck. Together they had 3 children. Joseph, the eldest at 14, was on the edge of manhood. He worked alongside his father, learning to hunt deer and plant corn, his eyes already set on the responsibilities he would inherit one day. Mary, 10 years old, was quieter, preferring to sit by her mother's side, sketching shapes in the dirt or humming songs as she gathered herbs. And then there was David, only 6, a boy whose laughter echoed through the canyon walls, chasing lizards and kicking up dust with his small bare feet. To those who knew them, the Yazzies seemed strong, rooted like the juniper trees. But beneath the surface, unease had begun to spread. Government officials had been pressing harder each year, urging native families to send their children to distant boarding schools where their language would be stripped from them, where their braids would be cut, and where silence was enforced with punishment. Thomas had refused. "My children will not forget who they are," he had told the agent who rode out to their land. His defiance made him a target. The weeks that followed were tense. Strangers were seen riding through the reservation, men in suits and uniforms asking questions. At night, Thomas kept his rifle close. Elena whispered of bad omens, dreams in which fire consumed their home, and voices called out from the earth. On the evening of August 12, 1927, the sun bled red into the horizon. The Yazzies shared a simple meal together. Beans, corn, and bread Elena had baked that morning. Joseph teased his little brother. Mary sang softly to herself, and Thomas sat quietly, his mind troubled by shadows he did not speak aloud. When the meal was done, the children ran outside to watch the stars emerge in the desert sky. It was the last time anyone saw the Yazzie family alive. The next morning, a neighbor passing by found the house eerily silent. The door was ajar, the cooking fire cold, the beds empty. A half-finished basket of corn sat on the table, as though the family had simply stepped outside and vanished into thin air. But their horses were still in the corral. Their belongings, their blankets, their tools, everything remained. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no note, no explanation. The entire Yazzie family, Thomas, Elena, Joseph, Mary, and David, was gone. Word spread quickly across the reservation, panic settling in like a heavy fog. Some whispered of abduction, others of violence. A few muttered that the government had finally taken the children by force, but no one could explain why the parents, too, would vanish without a trace. The authorities, when finally called, gave little more than a shrug. "Maybe they left on their own," the sheriff said, barely glancing at the home. "Maybe they went to the city for work." To him, a missing native family was not worth the ink of a formal report, but the people of the reservation knew better. Families did not vanish willingly, leaving behind food still warm on the table. Something had happened in the night of August 12th, something no one could name, but everyone feared. The silence that followed was almost worse than the disappearance itself. The house stood empty, abandoned, a hollow reminder of the family that had once filled it with laughter. Neighbors avoided the place, whispering that the land itself had swallowed the Yazzies. Years passed, then decades. The story of the Yazzie family became legend, spoken in hushed tones, a warning of how quickly even the strongest roots could be torn away. Parents told their children never to wander alone at night, never to question too loudly, never to stand too boldly against those in power. By the 1950s, the memory of the Yazzies was fading into silence. By the 1970s, only a few elders still told the story around fires. And by the 1990s, it was a ghost story, a half-forgotten tragedy buried beneath years of neglect. But the blood of the Yazzies had not vanished. In 1997, 70 years after the family disappeared, their grandson, a man who had grown up hearing fragments of the tale, his heart restless with unanswered questions, would uncover a truth darker and more shocking than anyone had imagined. The story of the Yazzie family was not finished. It was only buried, waiting for someone with the courage to unearth it. 70 years had passed since the night the Yazzie family vanished. By 1997, their adobe home was nothing more than a ruin, a crumbling skeleton of mud walls half swallowed by desert wind and sand. Few people alive could even remember their names, and among the younger generation the story of the Yazzies had drifted into myth, told like a ghost tale whispered to children. But for one man, it was not myth. It was blood. His name was Michael Yazzie, grandson of Thomas and Elena. Michael had grown up in Flagstaff, raised by his father, Thomas's younger brother Samuel, who had been only a boy himself when the family disappeared. Samuel had not been living in the Yazzie home that summer of 1927. He had been sent to live with relatives 2 towns away. That accident of fate had saved his life, but it left him with scars deeper than any wound. Michael remembered his father speaking rarely of what had happened. Only on rare nights, softened by whiskey, would Samuel mention the shadows of 1927. "They didn't just leave," he would whisper. "Don't let anyone tell you that. They were taken." And the world turned away. Then he would fall silent, his eyes dark with grief. When Samuel died in 1995, Michael inherited a weathered trunk from his father. For nearly 2 years it sat untouched in Michael's garage, too heavy with unspoken history. But in the spring of 1997, as Michael sorted through belongings, he finally opened it. Inside he found old letters, a faded photograph of the family, and a cracked leather-bound journal. The photograph was haunting. Thomas and Elena standing proudly with their 3 children in front of their home, their faces solemn yet strong. Michael studied the faces of Joseph, Mary, and little David, realizing these were his own blood. Children whose names had been erased from memory. But it was the journal that shook him most. Written in his grandfather Thomas's hand, The entries from the summer of 1927 spoke of increasing pressure from government agents and church missionaries. "They came again today," one entry read. "They want the children for the school. I told them no. We will not give them over." Another entry, dated just days before the disappearance, read, "I fear something is coming. At night I hear riders. Elena prays, but she knows too. They want more than our land. They want our silence." Michael's hands trembled as he closed the journal. Here was proof, at least in his grandfather's own words, that the family had not left willingly. They had been under threat. He could not let the matter rest. He felt the weight of 70 years pressing on his shoulders, a responsibility not just to his family but to history itself. He owed it to them to find out the truth. Michael returned to the reservation for the first time in years. The old Yazzie home was nearly gone, but standing in its ruins stirred something in him. A whisper, a presence, as if the land itself remembered. He began asking questions. At first, people dismissed him. That was long ago, they said. Best to leave it in the past. But Michael was persistent. Slowly, elders began to share fragments. One remembered waking to distant screams that night. Another recalled seeing wagons leaving the mission school at dawn, moving toward the canyon. Yet another whispered of unmarked graves, hidden by officials, covered quickly before questions could be asked. Michael kept notes, recording every word. He searched county archives in dusty courthouses, where clerks looked at him with annoyance when he asked for files from 1927. Most records had been lost or misfiled, but occasionally he found hints. Letters from government Indian agents, mentions of relocations, vague references to families who no longer reside on the land. None named the Yazzies directly, but the pattern was clear. The deeper he dug, the more resistance he met. Local officials told him there was nothing to be found. Church representatives warned him against stirring old ghosts. More than once, he returned to his motel to find his belongings moved, as though someone had entered while he was gone. But Michael was relentless. He remembered his father's words spoken in hushed tones. They were taken. The world turned away. One night, while speaking with an elderly man who had been a boy in 1927, Michael heard the first direct link. The old man's voice shook as he recalled what he had seen. "Your grandfather," he whispered. "He fought. He stood against them. I remember soldiers. 2 trucks, men with rifles. They came at night. We heard shouting, then silence. In the morning, the house was empty." Michael felt his blood run cold. Soldiers, trucks, rifles. This had not been a disappearance. It had been a raid. He left that night with his notebook filled, but his heart heavier than ever. If what the elder said was true, the Yazzie family had not vanished into thin air. They had been erased, taken deliberately by forces far larger than one family could resist. And somewhere, Michael knew, there had to be evidence. Proof hidden in forgotten records, buried in the land, or locked away in silence. 70 years of darkness was about to fracture. The grandson of Thomas and Elena Yazzie was ready to unearth the truth. Michael Yazzie's search consumed him. Each new fragment of testimony, each line of his grandfather's journal, only deepened the mystery. He had expected resistance, but not the wall of silence that rose against him. County clerks dismissed him, priests turned him away, and local officials avoided his calls altogether. The message was clear. Whatever had happened in 1927, it was not meant to be uncovered. Still, Michael pushed forward. He began with the county archives in Holbrook, a dusty building where records of land deeds, census rolls, and law enforcement logs were stacked in cabinets that had not been opened in decades. He filed a request to view documents from 1927 concerning the Yazzie land. The clerk, a thin man with a clipped tone, eyed him with suspicion. "Most of those files are gone. Fires, floods, poor record-keeping," he said, repeating excuses Michael had heard before. But Michael refused to be brushed aside. He spent days combing through bound volumes, faded carbon copies, and handwritten notes. At last, buried in a land deed registry, he found something. A transfer record dated September 1927, just 1 month after his family disappeared. The Yazzie homestead, once in Thomas's name, had been reassigned to the county, then sold to a private rancher connected to the local church. No documentation of consent, no evidence of sale. It was as though the family had simply ceased to exist and their land had been swallowed whole. Michael's hands shook as he copied the document. This was motive. His grandfather had resisted sending the children to the mission school. He had resisted giving up his land. And then, suddenly, the entire family was gone, and the land fell into someone else's hands. The deeper he dug, the more troubling the evidence became. He uncovered a sheriff's ledger from the same year, listing special night patrols conducted in August 1927. The entries were vague, assistance rendered, situation resolved, but the dates lined up with the night his family vanished. When he asked to see police reports from that month, the clerk hesitated, then returned with a thin file. Inside were just 2 sheets of paper, one noting family believed to have left area voluntarily, and another marked case closed. There was no investigation, no interviews, no evidence collected. It was not incompetence, it was deliberate erasure. Michael's frustration turned to rage. For 70 years, the official story had been a lie, that his family had abandoned their home, walked away, and never returned. Yet the documents hinted at something darker: state collusion, land theft, and the silencing of anyone who stood in the way. He began speaking to more elders, some now in their 90s, who still carried memories of those years. One woman, her voice quivering, told him she remembered the sound of trucks that summer night. They came with lanterns and rifles. We saw shadows moving across the canyon. My mother told me to stay quiet or we would be next. Another man whispered that he had seen soldiers load wagons behind the mission school in the weeks after. Blankets over the wagons. No one asked, no one dared. Each testimony was like a match striking dry tinder. Michael scribbled every word, building a record his family had been denied for 7 decades. But with each step closer to the truth, the resistance grew more menacing. Twice, he returned to his motel to find the door ajar, his papers rifled through, though nothing was stolen. One night, a black sedan idled outside for nearly an hour, its headlights dark, its presence a silent warning. The message was unmistakable. Stop digging. Instead, Michael pushed harder. He wrote letters to state archives, filed formal requests under the Freedom of Information Act, pressed for military and church records from 1927. Most replies came back the same. No record found. But then, one envelope arrived with a single sheet of paper inside, an unsigned, anonymous note written in shaky handwriting. It read, "Look beneath the mission. That is where the voices are buried." Michael stared at the words, his pulse quickening. The mission school. His grandfather's journal had mentioned it. The elders had whispered about it. And now this anonymous note pointed directly there. That night, he drove to the outskirts of the reservation where the old mission still stood. Its walls crumbling, its windows broken. Abandoned, but not forgotten. The building loomed in the moonlight like a skeleton of authority, a monument to decades of silence. As he stepped closer, the desert wind carried an eerie stillness. Michael's flashlight swept across boarded doors and rusted locks. The air smelled of mildew, dust, and something heavier. Something that felt like memory. He tightened his grip on the journal in his pocket, his grandfather's voice echoing in his mind. They want more than our land. They want our silence. Michael knew then that the silence was about to be broken. Whatever lay beneath the mission, whatever had been hidden there for 70 years, was waiting to be uncovered. The mission stood like a shadow from another age, its broken cross leaning precariously, its walls cracked by time. By 1997, it had long been abandoned, yet the weight of its presence remained. Elders avoided walking near it. Children dared each other to get close but rarely crossed the threshold. For Michael, standing before its rotting doors, the building was not just stone and timber. It was a graveyard of silence. He circled the perimeter first, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Tall weeds crept against the foundation, and broken boards flapped in the wind. Windows had been shattered, leaving jagged mouths gaping into hollow rooms. At the rear, half buried by sand, he spotted a rusted cellar door. A thick padlock clung to it, eaten by years of weather. The words from the anonymous note echoed in his head. "Look beneath the mission. That is where the voices are buried." Michael's heart pounded as he forced the lock with a crowbar he'd brought. It gave way with a groan, metal snapping like brittle bone. The cellar door creaked open, exhaling a gust of cold air that smelled of damp earth and mildew. For a moment, Michael hesitated. He had spent months chasing whispers and old paper trails, yet stepping into the mission basement felt like crossing into the heart of the truth itself. The stairs were narrow, descending into thick darkness. His flashlight beam trembled as it cut across stone walls and low ceilings. At the bottom, a hallway stretched into shadow, lined with small rooms. The air was heavy, as if it had not been disturbed in decades. The first rooms he entered were empty, only scraps of furniture and broken chairs left behind. But on one wall, his light caught something faint. Scratches etched into the plaster. He leaned closer, brushing away cobwebs. The marks were deliberate, claw-like grooves running downward, as if small hands had once scraped in desperation. Beneath the scratches, faint words were carved in a shaky hand. "We are still here." Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. The words were a whisper across time, a message left behind by those who had vanished. Deeper into the basement, he found remnants that made his stomach twist. A child's shoe, its leather cracked. A small wooden toy, broken in half. A length of ribbon, discolored with age. They lay scattered in the dirt as if dropped suddenly, abandoned in haste. He knelt, his hands trembling as he picked them up, imagining his lost relatives. The children, Joseph, Mary, little David. Could these have belonged to them, or to other children swallowed by this place? The silence was suffocating. Every creak of the old building above felt like footsteps. Every whisper of wind like a voice calling from the walls. He forced himself to move forward, deeper still. At the far end of the basement, he discovered a heavy steel door bolted from the outside. The metal was rusted, streaked with red-brown, but still intact. His pulse hammered as he pressed against it, hearing nothing but silence. The door swung open with effort, revealing a small room no larger than a closet. Its dirt floor was uneven, and the stench of decay lingered faintly even after 70 years. Michael's flashlight swept across the corner and landed on something that made him stagger. Bones. Tiny fragments, brittle and scattered, half buried in the soil. Not enough to form a whole skeleton, but unmistakably human. His chest tightened, his breath ragged. He sank to his knees, brushing away dirt until he uncovered the curve of a child's rib cage. For a long moment, he could not move. The truth he had sought for so long now lay in front of him, silent and devastating. His family had not vanished into thin air. They had been here, beneath the mission, erased and buried. On the wall above the bones, faintly visible in the light, another set of carvings appeared. Initials. M.Y. Michael's hand shook as he traced them. Mary Yazzie, his aunt, who had been only 10 years old when she disappeared in 1927. He sat back against the wall, tears burning his eyes. For 70 years, his family had been treated as ghosts, their story dismissed as legend. Yet here, in the dirt and stone of the mission basement, was proof of their suffering. Proof that they had been silenced not by choice, but by violence. But even as he absorbed the discovery, a sound cut through the silence above him. The heavy slam of a door, followed by the crunch of boots on the mission's floorboards. Michael froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He was not alone. Someone else had come into the mission. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as the echo of boots moved across the rotting floorboards above. He snapped off his flashlight and crouched low in the corner of the steel-doored room, clutching the crowbar in his hand. For a moment, the basement returned to pitch blackness, and the silence was unbearable. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, and the faint scrape of footsteps circling slowly above. The intruder wasn't trying to be quiet. Whoever it was wanted him to know they were there. Michael's mind raced. He had come seeking answers, not a confrontation. But the presence of bones and carvings on the wall told him that he was closer to the truth than anyone had ever wanted him to be. The timing was no coincidence. Someone had been watching, waiting for him to step too close to the silence. The footsteps paused, then descended onto the basement stairs. A beam of light cut through the darkness, a flashlight sweeping across the hall. Michael pressed his back against the wall, forcing himself to stay still, even as sweat trickled down his temple. The light moved closer, catching glimpses of cobwebbed walls and rusted door frames. Then a voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." The figure stepped into view, a tall man, dressed plainly, his face lined by age but his posture rigid, purposeful. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but there was a weight in his presence that spoke of authority. Michael recognized him faintly. He had seen this man sitting at tribal council meetings in recent years, one of the so-called elders, who maintained ties with county officials and church representatives. Michael's grip on the crowbar tightened. "Who are you?" The man's flashlight fixed directly on him, forcing him to squint. "That's not important. What matters is what you're looking for. This isn't your burden to carry." Michael's voice cracked, raw with anger. "My family vanished here. 70 years ago, they disappeared, and no one ever told the truth. I just found my aunt's initials carved into that wall. You want to tell me it's not my burden?" The man stepped closer, his face half lit. His eyes were cold, resigned. "We all know what happened here. We've known for decades, but dragging it out won't change the past. It will only bring more pain. Let the dead rest." Michael felt his chest tighten, rage surging through him. "Rest? You call this rest?" He pointed toward the corner where the bones lay scattered in the dirt. "You buried children here. You erased their names. That's not rest. It's a crime, and it's not finished until the truth is known." The man's jaw clenched. "If you dig too deep, you'll bring trouble down on everyone. Do you think the church, the county, the state, they'll let this story out? No. They'll come for you, and they'll come for the rest of us. Better to leave it in silence." Michael stepped forward, his flashlight beam cutting across the man's face. Silence is what killed them. Silence is what let their bodies rot in this dirt. I won't be part of it. The man didn't flinch, but his voice softened, almost pleading. Then know this. Your grandfather, Thomas, he fought. He fought hard. They came that night with soldiers, rifles, wagons. He refused to give you children over, and they took them all. He paused, the words hanging heavy. It wasn't just about your family. There were others. Families who resisted. They disappeared too. Michael's chest hollowed at the words. His grandfather's defiance, his refusal to hand over his children, it had sealed their fate. Yet it was not only his family. The scope was wider, larger, a system of forced removal, silenced by threats and violence. But before Michael could respond, the man stepped back into the hall. You won't find peace here. Leave before they know you've come this far. Then the light vanished, footsteps fading up the stairs, the door above slamming shut. Michael stood trembling in the dark, the silence pressing heavier than before. He felt the weight of what he had just heard. Confirmation, finally, that his family had been taken, not vanished. And worse, that other families had shared their fate, their stories buried in the earth beneath the mission. He turned his flashlight back on, sweeping it across the steel-doored room. The bones still lay in the corner, fragile and broken, a mute testimony against 70 years of denial. His aunt's initials gleamed faintly in the dirt-stained wall. Michael knelt, brushing soil away from the remains, his voice breaking into the silence. I found you. I swear I won't stop until the world knows. As he stood to leave, a sudden realization struck him. The man's words, though intended as warning, had given him a key. It wasn't just your family. There were others. The story was bigger than the Yazzies. It was an entire pattern of families erased, land stolen, lives buried in silence. And Michael knew then that he was no longer chasing just his family's truth. He was stepping into a fight against an entire system of injustice, one that had operated unchecked for generations. When Michael left the mission that night, the desert air felt different, thicker, sharper, like it carried the weight of all the silences whispered over 70 years. He drove in silence, headlights cutting across the black highway, the words of the man echoing in his head. It wasn't just your family. There were others. For days afterward, he couldn't shake it. He had started this journey searching for his grandfather, grandmother, and the 3 children whose faces haunted the one photograph in his trunk. But now, the circle had widened. What happened to the Yazzies wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern. Families silenced, land stolen, and the truth buried beneath official lies. Michael returned to the county archives with a new approach. Instead of only looking for the Yazzies, he began scanning census rolls, land transfers, and school registers from the 1920s and 30s. The gaps leapt out at him. Entire families listed one year, gone the next, with no record of relocation or death. Names vanished from school rosters without explanation. Land plots shifted ownership suspiciously soon after families disappeared. The same word appeared again and again in the margins of reports. Relocated. But there were no relocation records, no forwarding addresses, no burial certificates. Relocated was code for something else. Michael felt his stomach turn as the puzzle sharpened. His family hadn't simply vanished. They had been absorbed into a system that erased native families who resisted assimilation. Their disappearance had cleared the way for others to profit. Church missions that wanted obedience, county officials who wanted control, private ranchers who wanted land. He took his notes to one of the oldest tribal elders still living, a woman named Rose Begay, who had been a teenager in 1927. She received him in her modest home, her eyes clouded with age but sharp with memory. When he told her what he had found, she nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for someone to finally ask. "Your grandfather was not the only one," she whispered. "I remember wagons in those years, families who stood firm, who refused the schools. At night, men would come. The houses would be empty by morning. We all knew, but we couldn't speak. If we asked questions, we were next." Her words chilled him. He pressed for more. Finally, she told him something that made his breath catch. "I remember the Yazzie's house. I remember the day after. There were soldiers and men from the church. They loaded wagons at the mission, covered with tarps, but the air smelled of death." Michael's hands trembled as he wrote her words. Here was testimony, not just rumor, not just legend, but a first-hand account. His family had been taken to the mission, and something terrible had happened there, but the danger followed close behind. That evening, returning to his car, he found the trunk jimmied open and his notes scattered. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. He was being watched. Michael doubled his efforts. He requested documents from state archives, filed inquiries with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and reached out to historians who had studied native land dispossession. Most doors slammed shut, but one historian, an associate professor in Albuquerque, agreed to meet him. In her office, surrounded by stacks of books and yellowed maps, she listened carefully as he laid out the story. Then she pulled a folder from her shelf. Inside were clippings from the late 1920s, tiny back-page articles from regional newspapers. One headline read, "Native family abandons homestead, land to be resettled." Another, "County acquires vacant property after family departure." The professor tapped the pages. These weren't abandonments, they were cover stories. Disappearances wrapped in bureaucratic language. Your family's case is one of many. Michael felt the weight pressing heavier. For 70 years, newspapers had repeated the lies, officials had signed the transfers, and communities had been taught to forget. His family's suffering was part of a broader system of erasure that reached far beyond one canyon, one home. But proof was still fragile. Testimonies, hints, scraps of paper. He needed something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed as rumor or legend. His mind returned to the mission basement, to the bones, the shoe, the initials carved into the wall. If there were more, if he could document it properly, he would have the evidence to shatter the silence. That night, as he sat in his motel room copying notes, a knock rattled the door. Michael froze. Slowly, he approached, peering through the thin curtains. A man in a dark coat stood outside, his face shadowed. "Mr. Yazzie," the man called, his voice low but firm. "You're looking in places best left alone. Walk away before you end up like them." The knock came again, harder. Michael backed away, his heart pounding. He didn't open the door. After a long silence, footsteps receded, and the parking lot returned to stillness. But the warning was clear. He was close. Too close. Michael sat back at the desk, staring at the stack of evidence in front of him. He thought of his father's haunted eyes, his grandfather's final journal entries, the faces in the faded family photo. For 70 years, silence had been enforced by fear, but fear would not stop him now. He whispered into the empty room, to the spirits of those who had vanished, "I will bring you back. I will make them see." And with that vow, he prepared to return to the mission, not just to search, but to dig. Michael returned to the mission with a shovel, a flashlight, and a camera. It was nearly midnight when he parked his truck half a mile away and walked across the scrubland, the desert wind biting cold against his skin. Every instinct screamed that he was being followed, but the determination burning inside him drowned out the fear. For months, he had pieced together fragments, testimonies, ledgers, whispers. Now he needed the one thing that could no longer be denied: physical proof. The mission loomed like a corpse against the pale moon. Its cross was broken, its windows gaping hollow, its walls scarred by time. Michael slipped through the rear cellar door he had pried open before, the crowbar still jammed into the frame from his last visit. Inside, the air was stale, the silence suffocating. His flashlight beam cut across the narrow basement hall. The scratches on the plaster walls still stared back at him. We are still here. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move forward. At the far end, the steel-doored room waited, the one where he had found the bones and his Aunt Mary's initials. He knelt at the corner where the soil was uneven. With steady breaths, he drove the shovel into the ground. The dirt was dry and compacted, resisting each stroke, but Michael kept digging, sweat dripping despite the chill. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then the blade struck something solid. His stomach twisted as he crouched and brushed away soil with his hands. Beneath the dirt lay more bones. Larger this time, the curve of a skull, brittle ribs collapsed inward. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. His light trembled as he uncovered more. Not one set of remains, but several, layered together in the shallow earth. He realized with a sickening clarity, this was not just a hiding place. It was a grave. The air grew heavier as he pulled more dirt aside, exposing fragments of clothing preserved in the dry earth. A torn shirt, the faded hem of a skirt, the edge of a small boot. These were not relics. These were the remnants of people, families, swallowed by the mission's silence. Michael's hands shook violently as he took photographs, each flash puncturing the dark. Proof. Finally, undeniable proof. He whispered through clenched teeth, "Grandfather, I found you." But his relief was short-lived. The sound of footsteps echoed again above, heavier than before. This time, there was more than one person. Voices murmured, then a door slammed. Michael froze, his flashlight off, crouched in darkness. The basement door creaked open. Flashlight beams swept across the hall. Shadows moved closer. Michael's chest seized. He stuffed the camera into his bag, heart pounding, and gripped the crowbar like a weapon. He could hear the men descending, 2, maybe 3. Their voices carried low, but he caught enough. Told him to stop. He didn't listen. We finish it here. Michael's blood turned cold. They weren't here to warn him anymore. They were here to silence him. The men's beams cut through the hall, closing in on the steel-doored room. Michael crouched lower, his breath shallow, the dirt of the grave clinging to his clothes. For a moment, he thought of fleeing, but there was no way past them without being seen. His eyes darted to the corner. In the shadows, half buried in soil, something gleamed faintly, an old locket. With shaking hands, he scooped it up. Inside, behind cracked glass, was a faded photograph of a woman and 3 children. His grandmother Elena, Joseph, Mary, little David. The last image of them together, buried 70 years under silence. Michael clutched it tightly, tears burning his eyes. This was the truth he had come for, the truth his enemies wanted erased forever. The voices grew louder, beams of light now flooding the doorway. Michael pressed back against the wall, heart hammering, gripping the crowbar with one hand and the locket with the other. He knew in that moment the truth was no longer just his to find, it was his to protect, to carry into the light, even if it cost him everything. The basement glowed with jagged beams of flashlight, slicing through the dark like searchlights. Michael crouched in the far corner, the locket clenched in his fist, the crowbar slick in his other hand. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was no way out except past the men who had come for him. Their boots clattered against the stone steps, 3 figures descending into the basement. The first beam swept the walls, passing dangerously close to the scratches carved decades ago. "We are still here." Another beam swept over the steel door. Then came the voice, calm but cold. "Michael Yazzie, we know you're down here. Put the camera down and we'll let you walk away." Michael's stomach tightened. He could hear in the man's tone that it was a lie. They hadn't come to bargain, they'd come to erase him, just as they had erased the Yazzies 70 years ago. Silence stretched. Dust motes swirled in the beams of light. Then Michael's voice cracked through the dark, steadier than he felt. "I found them. Their bones, their clothes, their names. The whole world is going to see what you did." The men froze. One cursed under his breath. Another hissed, "Take it from him." Flashlights swung toward the steel-doored room. Michael's pulse exploded in his ears. He shoved the locket into his pocket, grabbed his camera bag, and bolted through the side hall just as the men's lights cut across the doorway. Shouts erupted. Boots pounded after him. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and half-collapsed rooms. Michael's flashlight swung wildly as he sprinted, dust choking the air. Behind him, beams slashed closer, voices echoing. "Stop him! He can't leave with it!" He barreled up the narrow stairs, shoulders slamming the walls. The cellar door groaned as he shoved it open, the desert night flooding in. He scrambled into the open air, lungs burning, the mission looming behind him like a monster. But the men were right behind. One lunged at him, catching his arm. Michael twisted, swinging the crowbar with every ounce of fear and fury. The metal connected with a sickening thud, and the man crumpled into the dirt. The others roared, closing in. Michael staggered to his truck, fumbling the keys with shaking hands. A hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back, but he slammed his elbow into the attacker's ribs and threw himself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life just as a flashlight smashed against his window. Glass shattered, raining across the seat. Michael ducked low and floored the accelerator. The truck tore across the desert scrub, rocks flying under its wheels. Behind him, the men shouted, their beams flickering smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. Michael didn't slow until he hit the highway miles away. His hands trembled violently on the wheel, blood dripping from a cut across his forehead. On the passenger seat, his camera bag lay intact, the locket glinting faintly in the moonlight. For the first time, he let out a sob that had been caged inside him for months. He had the proof, bones, clothing, the locket. And though men had chased him into the night, he had escaped. But Michael knew this wasn't over. Those men weren't acting alone. They were protectors of a silence that had lasted generations. Church officials, county enforcers, people who had profited from stolen land and erased families. They would not let him walk away easily. Yet, as he sped down the empty highway, dust trailing behind him, Michael felt something stronger than fear. It was resolve. For 70 years, the Yazzies had lain in silence, their story buried in dirt. Now he carried their truth in his hands, and no threat could make him forget it. He whispered into the night, voice raw but steady, "You're coming home now." The locket gleamed against the dashboard, the faint smile of his grandmother and the children staring back at him. They had been lost for generations, but the silence was broken. By dawn, Michael's truck rolled into Albuquerque. Its sides scraped with desert dust. The windshield cracked where the flashlight had shattered it. He hadn't slept. His hands were still trembling on the wheel, his clothes caked with dirt from the grave beneath the mission. On the passenger seat sat the two most important items he had ever carried: his camera bag, filled with photographs of bones, clothing, initials carved into walls, and the small locket, the faded faces of Elena, Joseph, Mary, and David, staring back at him from behind cracked glass. Michael knew he couldn't do this alone anymore. The men at the mission had made that clear. Whatever forces were protecting the secret, they weren't a few old watchmen. This was an institution, a web of officials, church authorities, and county men who had benefited from stolen land and silence for decades. He reached out first to Rachel Whitman, a journalist at a regional paper who had spent years covering native rights cases. She listened without interruption as he laid the photographs on her desk, her hand hovering over the image of the bones half buried in dirt. When he finished, she looked up, her face pale but steady. "This isn't just a family tragedy, Michael. This is systemic. If what you're showing me is real, it's evidence of crimes, murder, land theft, cover-up. People will want this buried." "They already tried," Michael whispered, his voice raw. "Last night." He showed her the cut on his forehead, the shattered glass still in his hair. "I barely got out." Rachel exhaled slowly, then pulled the photos closer. "If we run this, we'll need corroboration. Eyewitness accounts, records. You said there were elders who remembered?" Michael nodded. Within a week, Rachel and her paper sent a small team out with him to interview surviving elders. They recorded testimonies of wagons moving under cover of darkness, of screams carried on the wind in 1927, of families who resisted boarding schools and vanished overnight. They spoke to Rose Begay, the woman who had described the smell of death near the mission. She repeated her words on camera, her voice shaking but firm. "We all knew. We were told to stay quiet. If we spoke, we would disappear too. But now the silence has lasted too long." The paper began pulling records too: land deeds, transfer logs, even old maps. One deed after another showed the same pattern. Native families vanished, their land reassigned to county control, then sold or leased to ranchers tied to the church. The Yazzie case was one of many. The story began to take shape, brick by brick. A network of dispossession cloaked in official paperwork, backed by silent raids, erased by bureaucratic language. Relocated. Abandoned. Case closed. But as the investigation widened, the threats returned. Rachel's editor received anonymous phone calls warning him to kill the story or pay the price. Michael's motel room was broken into a second time, his notes scattered across the floor. One night, his truck was set on fire in the parking lot of a diner. He barely escaped with the camera bag in his arms. Yet every act of intimidation only hardened his resolve. He thought of his grandfather Thomas's journal, his words written in 1927. "They want more than our land. They want our silence." Michael refused to give them either. In September of 1997, the story finally broke. The front page of the Albuquerque Tribune carried the headline, "Buried Voices, Native Families' 1927 Disappearance Tied to Mission Grave." The photographs were there for all to see. Bones in the dirt, initials carved into plaster, the locket clutched in Michael's hand. Eyewitness testimonies filled the pages. Land records told the rest. The response was immediate. Outrage erupted across the state. Tribal leaders demanded federal investigations. Families who had lost relatives in the 1920s and 30s came forward with their own stories, recognizing the same patterns, the same silences. Relocated, they had been told. Now they knew the truth. But not everyone welcomed the exposure. Church representatives dismissed the findings as misinterpretations of history. County officials called it sensationalism. And the men who had chased Michael from the mission? They remained faceless, silent, shadows in the background. Still, the silence was broken. For the first time in 70 years, the Yazzie family's story was not a whisper. It was a headline. Michael stood outside the paper's office the morning the issue hit stands. He watched as people gathered around the news racks, unfolding the front page, their eyes widening at the images. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others wept openly. He slipped his hand into his pocket, feeling the weight of the locket. His grandmother's eyes, his aunt and uncle's young faces, stared up at him from the faded photograph. For decades, they had been buried beneath dirt and lies. Now, finally, the world was beginning to see them. But Michael knew this was only the beginning. The exposure was a crack in the dam. Behind it lay decades of silence, generations of stolen lives, entire families erased. The question was no longer whether the truth would come out. It was whether the world was ready to face it. The story rippled like fire across dry grass. Within days of the newspaper's publication, national outlets picked it up. Headlines now naming the Yazzie family, the mission school, and the decades-long cover-up. Federal investigators arrived, cameras in tow, digging not only into Michael's photographs but into church archives, county land records, and forgotten testimonies. For the first time in 70 years, silence cracked. At the mission site, federal teams began excavation. What Michael had uncovered was only the beginning. Beneath the rotting foundation, more shallow graves emerged. Small skeletons, fragments of clothing, faded shoes. Each new discovery drew crowds. Tribal families clutching photographs of their own missing loved ones, hoping for recognition, fearing confirmation. Michael stood at the edge of the dig, the locket heavy in his palm. He felt both vindicated and hollow. The truth he had chased, the truth that had nearly cost him his life, was finally undeniable. Yet, standing before the graves, the enormity of the loss pressed down on him. It was not just his family, it was dozens of families. Children taken, parents erased, lives stolen for the sake of obedience and land. National outrage grew. Congressional hearings were called. Church leaders were summoned, some dodging questions, others bowing their heads in shame. Survivors of the boarding school era stepped forward with their stories. Haircut, language beaten out of them, friends who vanished overnight. The Yazzie case had opened a wound that stretched far beyond Arizona. It had cracked open an entire history America had tried to forget. But amid the politics, the investigations, the hearings, something deeper happened in the community. In November 1997, a memorial was held on the reservation, the first of its kind. Hundreds gathered, elders, children, tribal leaders, families from across the state. A fire was lit at the center. Names were read aloud, names pulled from old registers, whispered in testimonies, carved in initials on plaster walls. Among them, 5 voices finally returned to memory: Thomas, Elena, Joseph, Mary, and David Yazzie. Michael stood before the crowd, holding the locket up to the firelight. His voice trembled but carried strong. For 70 years, they told us to be silent. They told us our family had abandoned us, that our people had vanished by choice. But silence is not truth. My grandfather fought. My grandmother prayed. My aunts and uncles lived. They were taken. They were buried. And now, after 70 years, they are home. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then the elders began to sing, low, mournful songs of loss, rising into chants of resilience. The sound carried into the desert night, the kind of sound that could never again be silenced. Michael's tears burned hot, but for the first time they carried release instead of rage. He felt his father's spirit beside him, his grandfather's voice in the wind, his grandmother's hands folded over his. He had fulfilled the promise whispered into the dirt basement weeks before. I will bring you back. I will make them see." As the fire crackled, he pressed the locket to his chest. The photograph inside, cracked and faded, glowed in the light. He imagined his Aunt Mary's hands carving those initials into the plaster wall. M.Y. We are still here. Now, the world knew they were. The silence had ended. The Yazzie family's story, buried for 70 years, was no longer a ghost. It was history, it was truth, and it was justice.